Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast, I'm joined by Nathan Scoggins, director of What Remains, a film about faith, forgiveness, and a murder mystery. Plus, scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this. Thanks so much for joining me this week. We have a huge announcement coming up on May 4th, Star Wars Day. So make sure you check our website, our YouTube channel, our Facebook page and groups. I can't wait for you to hear more about it, but you'll have to wait until May 4th. Well, Sunday was Easter, or Resurrection Sunday, as I prefer to say. So let's read Luke 24, 1 through 9. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood before them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the others. Jesus' resurrection is the focal point of Christianity. It is the moment that death and the grave are defeated, and that gives us hope for an eternity with Christ. It is the good news. We must share this good news with those around us. I serve weekly with believers from around the world who are sharing the gospel in dark and dangerous places. Brave men and women who are not ashamed to lay down their lives for Christ. They're sharing the best story ever and using new ways to share it digitally. It's exciting to see, and I'm thankful to be a small part of what's happening. He is truly risen. Well, before we get to our interview, let's do some nerdy news. The Super Mario Brothers movie took first place at the box office this weekend with $146 million, coming in well above the projections. And it took in another $173 million in foreign markets for a global opening of $377 million. That's quite a bit more than any opening weekend for any recent movies. This is another example of critics panning a movie that the audience absolutely loved. With a 56% critics score on Rotten Tomatoes, but a 96% audience score. You'll have to decide which group you're going to side with. Star Wars Celebration was this past weekend, and there are a ton of announcements coming out. I only have time to share a couple right now. First, Lucasfilm has announced 3 new movies in the Star Wars universe, spanning a huge time frame. James Mangold will be directing a film set in the dawn of the Jedi, which will be approximately 25,000 years before the birth of the Empire. It'll explore the origins of the very first Jedi that tapped into the Force. Dave Filoni will be directing a film that will bring together all the parts of the growing Mandoverse and will focus on the escalating war between the Imperial Remnant and the New Republic. Expect to see all the characters we've seen across the Mandalorian series, the Book of Boba Fett, and the upcoming Ahsoka series. Expect them all to appear. And finally, Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, I probably butchered that name, forgive me, will direct a film set 15 years after The Rise of Skywalker. Daisy Ridley will be returning as Rey, and the story will follow as she builds a new Jedi Order. The new trailer for the Disney Plus show Ahsoka dropped this weekend to rave reviews. We see Rosario Dawson in her role as the title character. We see Force wielders, droids, space battles, and a glimpse of Lars Mikkelsen from behind as Thrawn. Expect this to be an epic search for Ezra Bridger and to find out more about the coming darkness that has been hinted at in the Mandalorian series. The trailer looks great and it feels very much like Star Wars. I can't wait for this one. Now let's get into our interview with director Nathan Scoggins. Nate Scoggins, it is so great to have you on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast today.
Great to be here, Ricky. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Hello, Christian nerds. Let's unite.
Absolutely. Well, I know I brought you on mostly to talk about your movie that came out last year, but give us just a little background who Nate Scoggins is.
I'm very mysterious. I came from the wind, and I will disappear into the plains, and none shall be the wiser. That feels like a very Tolkien way to describe myself. So we're getting nerdy already. And by the way, I did grow up homeschooled in Rhode Island, and my dad read me the Narnia books as a kid, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a kid, and the Space trilogy as a kid. So I feel, and I would watch Star Trek reruns when I was a very little kid before Next Generation came out, and then Next Generation came out. I loved that, and I was up until probably too late last night watching the first 3 episodes of Picard. So I am a nerd who is also a Christian. I feel like my bona fides are bona fide. So I grew up in Rhode Island. I was a pastor's kid. My dad was a pastor and later a missionary who spent a lot of time in the Middle East in various countries that I probably shouldn't name because I can't pronounce them. And it's funny when you grow up in that kind of really intentional ministry environment, you kind of think it's normal. You kind of think it's normal for your dad to be on the phone on the weekend lobbying to get a missionary out of Turkey, and having Arab sheikhs coming by our house with gifts. Like you think that's normal because you don't know anything else, right? And because I was homeschooled, I had this kind of insular world, and so I was studying Greek and Latin when I was a little kid, and you kind of thought that was a normal thing. And you're talking with kids at Sunday school or that youth theater, which was kind of the secular thing that I did when I was a kid. And you're mentioning like, oh, well, I was just reading in the Greek version of Matthew the other day, and you realize that other 10-year-olds aren't saying things like that. So I grew up a weird kid in that way, in that there was a bit of this insular environment that I grew up in. But it was also really interesting because despite that, I think you kind of think about that kind of growing up a certain way. But I also grew up with a deep love of movies. I grew up in the advent of the VCR because my dad was a pastor and they don't pay pastors a lot of money. We couldn't afford a VCR, so we would go and rent one from Rent-A-Center. Mm. And we would go to the local video store by the Almax up the street. And my mom knew that I was a huge fan of Superman. And so she knew that I wanted to rent Superman 4 or something like that with Gene Hackman. And she said, well, if you're going to rent Superman 4, you really should, and watch Gene Hackman, you really should watch Hoosiers which is, I think is an iconic Gene Hackman.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And she knew that I loved Empire Strikes Back and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so when I would want to rent those, she knew they were written by Larry Kasdan. And she said, well, the writer of those movies also wrote Grand Canyon and The Accidental Tourist. And so you should really watch that. And she knew that I really liked Robert De Niro. And so she said, you should watch The Mission. And so, I'm 11 and watching these movies that I probably shouldn't be watching. But, it was kind of this environment that I grew up in where I watched Citizen Kane and It's a Wonderful Life so closely together that I confused the two in my head for a long time as a little kid. So I would be watching Citizen Kane going, wait, when is the angel going to show up and help Citizen Kane become, a better person? Because they're black and white movies. They were made in the 1940s. That's kind of fractured storytelling. So I really credit my mom for raising me with a love of film and a love of movies and a love of watching Arsenic and Old Lace, watching some of these old classics, in addition to watching movies like Children of a Lesser God and this kind of stuff, which was wild, right? To grow up in a very sort of faith-centric environment, but not to be cloistered and sheltered. I mean, I was I think 10 or 11 when Beverly Hills 90210 came on, and all my friends, some of my friends were watching it, and so I told my cousin was watching it. He had me watch it with him once. And I came home to my parents like, hey, I watched this show. It's about teenagers. And my parents didn't do what a lot of other Christian parents did at the time. They didn't censor it or cut it off. They were like, let's watch it as a family and let's talk about the show. And so I grew up sort of really aware of pop culture and with a real deep appreciation of pop culture and with a real appreciation of Star Trek and Star Wars, but like being able to know that like who George Lucas was and all that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of where I came from. But Rhode Island was a place where it's like, if you said that you wanted to go to Hollywood, it was like saying you wanted to go to Mars. Like people were just like, why would you do that? First of all, Hollywood's weird. Second of all, it's wicked far, And so I just, and so I grew up weird kid. I grew up, I was an athlete in high school, and then my parents would throw me in the back of a van and I would drive to youth theater and jump out of the van in costume and run out on stage and perform Shakespeare or perform, Curse of the Werewolf or all these things. But as a result, I think I grew up with this appreciation of the ways in which faith and art are connected, not divided. And sort of in an environment where a lot of people look at culture wars, I saw something very different. I remember seeing Shawshank Redemption. I think it was 16, and just my mind was blown because I saw what was in there in terms of the gospel, the good news that I believed in. And then I went to a secular college, Wesleyan University, which has a great film program. And I fell in love with film. And I remember watching The Searchers the first time and just my mind being blown and just being aware of film, not just as entertainment, but also as art. And watching war films and watching Westerns and watching documentaries and all this kind of stuff. So I grew up with it, but it wasn't until I went to Wesleyan that, I heard stories about Michael Bay and Akiva Goldsman and Joss Whedon and, later Ruben Fleischer and all these other people who were able to make a go of it as a career. And that was the first time that it felt possible to do this as a gig. And then, you have to try to figure, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, like, who am I as an artist and a writer and storyteller? And that becomes a little bit of a journey because a lot of times, it can be just a journey for people to figure out, okay, art and creativity and spirituality, those are connected and that's good. But it's a whole other artistic journey to go on when you go, okay, so what do I have meaningful to contribute to the world? And what does that look like in terms of the stories that I want to tell? And what does that look like in terms of the films that I want to make, and how do I do that? But I knew that it wasn't going to happen in Rhode Island and Connecticut. And so after a couple of years after graduation, my wife and I threw everything in the U-Haul and ran away to join the circus. We've been in LA for 20 years and haven't looked back yet.
Awesome. Well, you have been, as you said, working in the film industry for quite some time. Writer, director, producer. Yep. And recently you made a film called What Remains.
Guilty, yes.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about What Remains.
So What Remains is a story. It's a film. It stars Kellen Lutz from the Twilight movies, Cress Williams from Black Lightning, Anne Heche in what was the last film role she completed before her untimely death about 6 months ago. And it's a little sort of Southern Gothic suspense drama about a pastor whose wife dies tragically in a home invasion gone wrong. And at his wife's funeral, in the eulogy, he chooses to announce that he has forgiven the man who committed the crime, and that he is actually lobbying for him to get a lighter sentence so that he can get out and make something of himself. And our movie really picks up 5 years later when the criminal, played by Kellen Lutz, returns to the small town, in essence, to try to earn the forgiveness of the pastor. And this does not go over well with the pastor's young son, who is 18 years old and is about to head off to college. And so the three of them, it's about the dynamic between the three of them. And it's also while the town sheriff, played by Anne Heche, plays a murder that might be connected. And so one of the questions that we're trying to, hopefully ask through the film is who is Kellen? Is Kellen really back for the right reasons? Is there something else going on? All that kind of stuff. And it really is a film about the cost of forgiveness, the cost of unforgiveness. It's about trying to do the right thing and grappling with what the right thing really is, and really grappling with the cost of grace and forgiveness. And our my producer on the film, Corey Pollard, says that it's about mercy and justice, which wins, mercy versus justice.
Awesome. Well, I know I asked this question before we started the interview, and I said maybe we should wait till then to discuss it further. So tell me, as a believer, as a filmmaker, do you see what remains as a Christian film, or is it just a film that happens to have some faith elements, or just a good story that is told by Christian artists?
Yeah, it's funny. We made the film in Texas, and we premiered it in December in Amarillo, just before we released theatrically, because we were out in movie theaters, and it's now out on DVD and Blu-ray, and it's available on digital. But we did a big premiere in Amarillo. We had about 900 people at this gorgeous premiere. And then we did a Q&A afterwards, and somebody raised their hand. And I did not realize that in Texas, film is a 2-syllable word. So this gentleman stood up and said, yeah, I really liked your film. And I said, thank you. And he said, I thought I knew where the movie was going for the first half, and then you really pulled the rug out from under me, and I did not know where the movie was going in the second half. And I appreciated that compliment, because I think a lot of times what we think of as Christian films are in some ways fairly predictable.
Yes.
We kind of, we sort of understand or think we understand what the story is going to be and how the story is going to go. And this is a very untypical film for that. We actually we premiered the film at the Austin Film Festival in October, and somebody, one of the great reviews we got, said, there's a lot of faith-based films out there that are drivel. This is a movie that isn't, because it chooses to take the subject on seriously. And as a result, this gentleman went on to, in Texas, went on to say, so is this a faith-based film? And I said, I don't know. I don't know if it's a faith-based film. I know that it's a movie about faith. And I know that faith is a subject that I'm very interested in, part of because of how I grew up, and part, because of how I live my life. But I don't think that it's, and look, I have friends, dear friends who work sort of in the faith-based market, and that's a very difficult market to get into. And I do think that there is a bit of a challenge in that, when we think about faith-based things or Christian things, a lot of times that is a marketing term, more than anything else. And I'm not opposed to it, I'm not opposed to that, but I do think that sometimes it does sort of put your movie into a certain category. And one of the great compliments that I've gotten from the film is people who aren't Christian, or have no real sort of faith background, who say, you write about faith in the way that I can understand it or relate to it. And part of that is, I think, because the character of Samuel, who plays a pivotal role in the film, is not a Christian, and he actively rejects his father's faith. And I tried to give Samuel a lot of bullets in his gun in terms of why he doesn't believe. And I think that a lot of times when you have a Christian film, you sort of stack the movie for the believers in the movie, right? You've got an atheist character who is clearly a villain, and you have the good Christian characters who are clearly virtuous. And I really like telling a story about Cress, who is the hero of our film. He is the protagonist of the film. He is the pastor who is trying to do the right thing, but he suffers for trying to do the right thing. And he's not even, again, another review in Austin said, this is a movie about a character who is not always sure that he is doing the right thing. And I think that, if you're a Christian, there is a blessed assurance that we have, but the blessed assurance that we have is the state of our souls, not the state of our day to day. And I really wanted to tell a story about that. So that's a very long answer to your question, because I do think that there is no such thing as a Christian chair, to quote C.S. Lewis, but there is a chair that is well made. And I do think that as a Christian, I am interested in telling stories about faith, and I don't want to see stories about faith just relegated to a Sunday morning sermon. And I do think that there are an awful lot of everyday folk who are trying to live out their life and live out their faith in their everyday life. And I really want to tell stories about people like that. And so I think where I've landed is that this isn't a faith-based film, especially because halfway through the movie, it takes a real turn that your grandma might not like. But I think it's an honest film. I think it's a truthful film. I think it's a film that reflects honest, true questions. And so I think that as a result, it is certainly relatable to a faith-based audience. But I forget who said this line, that good art should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And again, I've had a number of people come to me and say the questions that Samuel is asking about faith are the questions that I'm asking. And I think that's great. And I've had Christians and believers come to me and say, your movie made me really think about who in my life that I might be harboring unforgiveness towards, who I might need to forgive. And so I think that's great. You're trying to make a movie that wrestles openly and honestly with questions about faith in a way where people can relate to it wherever they are. Bono once said that because people hear that he's a believer, they think that is all the answers. And he said, I don't. I just have a different set of questions. And I think that's what I can say about my film. I think is that it is a movie that asks a ton of questions.
That's great. When you think about writing a film like this, or think about directing a film like this, do you go into it thinking I want to talk about your creation process a little bit. Do you think about it with the idea of, I want the viewer, this is what I want the viewer to walk away with? Or do you think of it more as, I want to tell this story and let the viewer figure out what they walk away with?
I think it's interesting. I mean, again, living in LA for a long time, and there's a lot of Christians who are here, contrary to sort of popular belief. And, a lot of us who were on the film are believers, and no one's hiding it. So it's like Cress and Kellen and myself and Ralph Winter and Corey Pollard and our team, the team that helped finance it at Sharpened Iron Shoes. We're all believers. And so, but one of the things that a lot of us talk about a lot is, I think a lot of times Christian films, or certainly a lot of Christian films, can start with a theme first. I want to make a movie about prayer, or I want to make a movie about, I don't know, whatever. They start with a subject, or they start with a theme. They start with something they want to say, right? And look, my dad is a pastor. I've got a number of friends who are pastors, and one of the things that you're doing when you are prepping your sermons is that you have to, it might be tempting to say, I'm going to preach about this week. But if you're really being honest with your hermeneutical flow, which is not a sentence I thought I would say this morning, but there we go. You start with what the text says, and then you let the text tell you what it says, and then you try to figure out how to apply it.
Yeah, this is the for those theological nerds out there, this is the eisegesis versus the exegesis.
Exactly. And I think that the same thing is true with art. I think a lot of times And there's a danger to that. There's a danger to a pastor who kind of says, I'm going to preach about this. I'm going to use this verse to say this thing, rather than I am going to say what this verse says and then try to apply it to what's happening. And I think the same thing is true with art. I think it's really dangerous a lot of times, because you wind up with dogmatic art when you're starting out going, this is what I'm going to say, because then the art becomes propaganda. I hope that he won't mind me mentioning him in this podcast, who knows if we'll ever see it. But Scott Derrickson talks a lot about how the best place for an artist to start is with questions rather than with answers. I want to ask this question of myself. Justin Marks, who is something of a friend, has written a bunch of big projects. He always says that the failure of an awful lot of artists, especially young artists, is that they think that story and filmmaking is about plot. And the danger with that is that you wind up with 120 perfectly competent pages of stuff happening without ever understanding the why it's happening. And Justin said, we were talking over lunch one day, and he said an awful lot of artists, young artists, don't do the internal work necessary on themselves to try to figure out, why are they telling the story? Why is the story personal to them? How do they find their way into it? And look, television is different, because TV, it's about, nailing the act breaks and all that kind of stuff. I understand that. But in film, you do get the opportunity to make it a little bit more personal. And as a result, if you're making it a little bit more personal, then I think that the best place to start is with the personal things you're wrestling with and asking and grappling with. And you might not necessarily know how that story ends. And so I think that is an opportunity to make really great art. I mean, for What Remains, I was asking some really hard questions. The whole thing of What Remains really started 10 years prior, when I was having an argument with somebody I cared about very, very much, who said, I think the family is, if I murder somebody, I call you, you help me bury the body. And I said, I think that's actually a dysfunctional family. That's the mafia. That's not, and it really came down to this thing of honesty and loyalty. Where do we fit on that axis? And for me, I'm fascinated by that. I'm haunted by that, troubled by that. And it was funny, because I didn't necessarily start What Remains with that process, but there is a scene in the film where two characters have to have a very intense conversation about exactly that question of honesty and loyalty. And when I wrote that scene, I still remember sitting in the chair. I was writing that scene, and I sat back, and I went, well, now I have to make this movie, because I figured out why I'm writing this movie. A lot of times you might not know as an artist why you're writing the story, but sooner or later you got to find out why you're writing the story. And for me, I think that, What Remains kind of came about because I'd been, I'd gotten a couple movies made, and I had made some commercials that had success, and I had, been hired to write a bunch of projects that hadn't gone anywhere. I'd written for, projects for some very well-known producers, some very well-known Christian producers, but they weren't going anywhere. And my wife said, what would you write if you didn't have to ask permission? If you didn't have to chase a green light, what would you just write for you? And What Remains was something that I wrote for me. And again, it was surprising when I realized why I was writing it for me. And then once I cracked that, it was like, oh, well, now let's go. So I think that, I don't know how many people listen to this, or how many artists are listening, but I think that whenever you find that personal reason to tell a story, that's your superpower. And I think that the personal reason to tell a story isn't, I have this truth that I want to share with the world, although there's nothing wrong with that. And in his excellent book on film directing, Making Movies, Sidney Lumet says there tends to be two types of directors. Ones who have a truth they want to say to the world, and a director who has a question they want to grapple with in front of the world. And I think that I'm really interested in the latter, because I think the latter is a better use of art. I think it makes a more interesting art. I think you feel it in the art more when the director is grappling with a fundamental questions. And I don't know, that's kind of how I'm wired anyway.
Nice. How, being a believer and having a film that has so much of a faith background in it, how do you go about getting something like this made? You know, when you've got your story, you know what you're going to tell, but how do you go about getting, the backing, the people together to actually make this be a reality?
Sure. That's always the question, right? I mean, especially when you're not necessarily working in the studio space. And the studio space is really hard. And I've written movies in the studio space, and I've got a couple of projects that are sort of competing in that space, and that's really hard because you're trying to get the attention of executives who have 30 projects that they're pushing, and you're trying to be 31, and you're trying to convince them why your project is more important than theirs and all that kind of stuff. It's highly competitive, and what they want and what they need changes from week to week. And so I think that there is something empowering when you say, screw it, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to make it happen. I'm not going to spend years, I don't know, rewriting something in the hopes that maybe it'll satisfy a studio mandate that week. There is something really nice about just saying, I'm just going to do this. But unless you are Dick Van Dyke at the opening of Mary Poppins, where you've got, all the instruments on your back, and you've got the harmonica and the cymbals and the drum and all that stuff, you do need people. And I do think that one of the things that was beautiful about What Remains was, again, being in LA for a long time, building relationships for 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, a lot of the relationships with the people who came on board the movie were 10, 15 years old. Corey Pollard, who was my line producer, physical producer in Texas. I've known him for 15 years since we met at Sundance in 2006. Ralph Winter it's an almost 20-year relationship that we have. He's produced a number of my projects, and Ralph Linhart, who was the DP on What Remains, shot my first feature film 15 years ago. So there are kind of long-standing relationships, and I think that if you're the kind of person who cares about people and tries to care about people well, and it doesn't mean that I'm perfect at it by any means, but I think if you're chasing and pursuing relational health, and you're the kind of person that people want to be around, if you're championing other people's successes, if you're rooting for other people, if you're being supportive of people, then you do kind of find that people will come around you when the time is right. And so what was remarkable was, after I wrote What Remains, and it took about 6 weeks to write the script, I sent it to Corey, and I sent it to Ralph, and I sent it to a number of people, and just kind of said, would you make this with me? And Ralph was the first person to say yes. And then Kellen said yes very quickly after that. I'd known Kellen for a long time. Cress said yes very quickly after that. Corey Pollard said yes. So I do think that it does take a village. And I always say this, making any film, but especially an independent film, it's like casting a dinner party. You want to go, okay, who do I want to be around? Who do I want to be in the foxhole with? Because when you're making an independent film, you don't have all the resources. A lot of times the studio in studios land, just throw money at it, and money can be a great forgiver of sins, because it didn't prep enough, just throw more money at it. We need last minute change, just throw money at it. You can lead positionally. But I knew that on this project, I really wanted to lead relationally, because we weren't paying people enough for them to overlook a multitude of sins. So for me, it really was, pulling on those relationship strings, and not in a manipulative way, but in a way where hopefully we were all able to go, look at what we all get to do. I mean, Corey, who's been a top of the line first AD, this is a chance for him to be a producer. And for Lonnie Irvin, my editor, this was his first feature that he had edited. For an awful lot of our crew, it was their first time getting a chance to step up in a big way. And so, if you're going to ask people to do that, you want to create an opportunity where they have a reason to say yes, because they get to do something they've never done before. They get to step up in a different way. But also you want them to go, look, we'll pay you, but we're not going to pay you what a TV show pays. We're not going to pay you what Netflix pays. So you really want to make sure that the experience is good. And honestly, before we left, I have a little small group, and we got together and prayed. And they said, "What are we praying for?" And I said, "I feel like I'm a competent filmmaker, feel like I can do a good job telling the story, but I really want the experience to be good. And we had a remarkable experience together where it was just we did it the way that I think it should be done, where the days were hard. We had hard work to do. We burned a truck. We had a train sequence. We had a chase, a car and foot chase scene, which was ultimately tragically cut from the film. But we were working hard, but we weren't inhumane. And I think that spirit, that vibe, is what gets people to say yes. And that's, and that makes it a little easier to ask people. And so all these people, we want to work together again because they saw what I did. They saw how I led. They saw how Corey and I led, and they said, yes, please, more. And so I'm trying to help Kellen on a project or two, and Cress and I have a couple of projects, and we're trying to do other stuff because we want to do more stuff the way that we did it.
Nice. Now, you said something interesting there. You said there was a scene that was tragically...
something interesting.
Something that spurred me to... you said lots of interesting things. Something that spurred me to ask a different question. You said that a scene was tragically cut from the film.
Yep.
When you look at the film as a whole, is the end result what you envisioned it to be? Or is it something better than what you originally thought? Or is there something that was left out that you feel like it's not quite up to the potential you had in mind?
Ooh, this is a spicy question, Ricky. It was interesting. Going back to just tying the knot on my previous thing, when you're shooting a movie, 12-hour days are customary.
Oh, yes.
14 to 16-hour days are often, they just happen.
Yeah.
A lot of our days, we shot 8 hours, 8.5.
Oh, wow.
9. We never went a full 12. The longest we went was 11. And I was so apologetic to our crew the one day we went to 11. And they said, dude, are you kidding? We've gotten so many days. You've been so easy. No problem. And so as a result, even with that, because we had our editor in Texas cutting with us, and so he was there every night. And so I'd shoot all day and then go to the studio, look at footage, and then I would be home in time to call my wife. And on more than one occasion, I called my wife, and I almost had no words for what we'd experienced on the set. Mm-hmm. Because she said, how's it going? I said, I am getting a better film than I deserve. Mm-hmm. And part of it is, look, you're shooting in Texas, you get a little bit more production value than if you're shooting in LA or some of these more expensive places. But also, Kellen brought it every day, and he's known for being such a physical actor, but there was such intensity in his performance. He worked the material. Cress was our bedrock every day, so consistent, so steady. Anne came in and she was a tornado in the best way possible. And she was always a little bit of a wild card, but she kept it fun and she kept it light. Stelio Savante, who wound up not just being in the film, but also being our executive producer, I asked him to lighten the moments whenever he could, to find little light moments. And he was able to find a couple that were a tremendous gift. Everybody, Marcus Gladney, who played Samuel, just devastating. And so I would come home from the set sometimes, like every day was Christmas. There was never something where we had to settle. And it was funny because even, we had a small crew, and a lot of these guys hadn't necessarily worked on anything. And there were a couple of shots where I thought we had to compromise and walk away. So like the opening shot where Anne drives in and we have this big crane thing, and we pushed in and all that stuff, and we did it 5 or 6 times, and it was just really hard. And eventually I said, guys, we just got to move on. I'm sorry. Hopefully we got it. And then we looked at the dailies and we got it. And I didn't think that we had. And so even things that where I thought, I think we're gonna have to compromise on this, we just got it. That train sequence that takes place about halfway through the film, we're very careful. We were very careful. We were very safe. We knew that we didn't want to get too close to train tracks. We didn't want to risk anything with our crew. But our DP had this idea of, would it be cool if like we could get a train going by? Now, we don't have the money to book a train, and we certainly don't have the money for take two of a train. And so, but Ryan Innes, who was one of our camera team on our camera team, his wife, I think, happened to work for the railroad, and so it was like Saturday night at 9, and we were moving over to the train tracks, and we were going to shoot the sequence. And if a train happened to go by, we were like, okay, maybe. And I asked him, I said, hey, does your wife know, or is there a train coming by? He said, yeah, there's two coming by before 10. I was like, well, maybe let's get lucky. And so we were able to get there and set up. And right as we heard the ding, 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 suddenly I turned to this conducting madman of, okay, camera A, go there, camera B, over there. At one point, like the train barrels by, we get this incredible shot, but we see everyone's shadows on the street. And so I yelled, hit the deck, everyone hit the deck. And so we all dropped and all this kind of stuff. But what came out was just this incredible sequence. And so, yeah, I think every day it was, the split screen sequence that takes place about halfway through the film. That was another sequence that it turned out better than I expected. And so, I'm so incredibly proud of the film, because for me, yeah, I think it did. I think it turned out better than I could have thought. And look, when you're making an independent film, you're always mindful of the fact that, look, it's a smaller film. But we nailed it. I mean, even, little moments like Juliana DeStefano came onto our show, and she's done a bunch of she's like a lifetime TV movie queen. And she came into our show, and we took an hour to rehearse. And she told me at one point, she said, oh, I never get a chance to rehearse. This is bliss. And so to be able to create that environment where your actors feel like they're doing good work, we're taking the time to get it right, we're not rushing things and compromising, and we're able to still get everything done in the time that we had. We did this in 17 days. And, wow. And while, there are some scenes that I miss greatly, one of them was this kind of really cool cop car foot chase thing where a cop is stalking Marcus towards the end of the film, and we did this whole sort of like fun like foot chase doubling back thing in the town square in Canyon. And I would have loved to have had it in the movie, but it just didn't work for the pacing, and we kind of needed to move things up. So while there are things that I probably miss, my editor paid me a great compliment. He said, because we kind of, I think, 6 or 7 sort of scenes from the movie, and he said, here's the thing, those scenes are all good. And so it means if we're cutting good stuff, it means that what's left is really good. And I had to agree.
Very cool. Well, if there is a aspiring filmmaker, director out there listening, watching right now, what is some advice you would give?
So I do a lot of mentoring. I do a lot of teaching in between projects, and actually a lot of our younger members of our crew, our PAs and stuff, were all recent film school alums who had come onto our show, and I was really excited to give them their first sort of jobs. But my cardinal rule whenever I'm mentoring or teaching is, if you really love film, there's 2 things you got to do. You got to watch stuff, and you got to make stuff. And if you're not making stuff, that's fine, but be watching stuff, be feeding your artist's soul. There's a great book by Julia Cameron called The Artist's Way, which really talks about taking care of your inner artist. And sometimes the best way to take care of your inner artist is to be fueling your inner artist with stuff. And so watching, it's interesting. There's so much, there's a ubiquity of content around us, right? It's content is everywhere, but as a result, we are spending so much time in our phones looking at TikTok or looking at Instagram. And I think that you want to be learning film aesthetics. You want to be learning, watching how Orson Welles transitions into and out of scenes in Citizen Kane. You want to be looking at how Scorsese and Thelma Shoemaker, edit a sequence and cut a sequence together. You want to be looking at how Spielberg crafts his master shots. You want to be looking at how Greta Gerwig gets into and out of scenes with so quickly. It's like becoming a master of cinematic language will only help you become a better filmmaker. So I do think that one of the real flaws that I'm seeing in a younger generation of filmmakers coming up is they're just not watching stuff. And so it's like watching stuff is crucial, I think, for being a good filmmaker. But then also just creating. Your first bunch of scripts are going to be awful. Um, Mark Duplass has this great book that he wrote with his brother Jay that I talk about all the time called Like Brothers, where he says, look, the best thing for young filmmakers to do is to make stuff with your friends at nights and on weekends. And those first things are going to be terrible. And you're going to make them with your friends. And then you're going to be really excited when you make something with your friends that isn't terrible. And then, you're going to make something with your friends that's actually kind of good. And then you're going to make something with your friends that's really good. And then you're on your way. And so I do think that is part of the thing is just, making stuff. But the other thing that I'll say is that, amateurs start, professionals finish. What really makes an artist stand out is that you're not just talking about the thing you're doing. You're talking about the thing you did. Like, we were really careful. We got some good media coverage from Variety the day before we wrapped. And we got announced in the trades. And part of it was because Ralph Winter, our producer, said, let's not talk about what we're going to do. Let's talk about what we did. And there is something empowering about saying, yeah, I'm not going to talk about it until I've done it. Because a lot of people are talking about what they're going to do someday, but someday never comes. And so I think that, and everyone can start, right? Like, everyone loves that first blush of a relationship. Oh, she's the one, he's the one. But it's like Scripture says, those who persevere to the end are saved. Those scripts that you actually type the end on, that's something you actually do something with. That film project where you did it. So I think for me, setting deadlines, setting goals, making stuff, and then realizing you're not a village unto yourself. You need people around you who can help you. And so finding those people who can help you make stuff, and you sort of rise up and get better together. Those are all things that I think are just so crucial for young artists.
Any upcoming projects that you're able to talk about?
The fabled question. Yeah, there are. I have 6 projects currently with different producers that we are moving down the road on. Cress and I have 2 projects together that we are waiting desperately for a distributor to approve our budget on. It's a TV thing that we'd love to be shooting later this year. And then there's another TV thing that's in the pipeline after that. There's a project called Joplin that I'd love to make about the true story of the Joplin, Missouri tornado that destroyed the city of Joplin about 10 years ago. And
it's funny that you mentioned that particular tornado. I was actually involved in making a faith-based film around the tornado that went through Moore in 10 years ago.
EF5, man, they were. I mean, this thing tore like a mile-wide gash in the town, and it was devastating. And the town came back 90 days later. The town father said, we're going to have a school year, we're going to have a football team, and so this football coach who's new to the town is sort of tasked with putting a team together and processing through his own PTSD. He's new to the town. He's new to, all this kind of stuff. And so it's this really inspirational, true story that I'd love to tell. And so,
are you doing a narrative or a documentary?
It's a narrative.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So, so there are projects like that I'm easy, that I'm trying to ease down the road. And, there's a strike that people are talking about here in Hollywood that might slow some things down. But
the writer's strike.
Exactly. But I'm just, I'm hustling away. I directed 2 episodes of a TV show last summer that is going to premiere later this year. So I've got plenty of things keeping me busy.
Awesome. Well, tell our audience, how can they keep up with what's going on in your life, Nate?
Sure. So you can, if you're interested, you can follow our film on Instagram, What Remains Film. It's our IG account. I'm Nate Scoggins on Instagram. And the website for the film, whatremains.co, is where you can sort of find information about the film. I'm also on Twitter at Nate Scoggins. I tend to tweet about film stuff, as well as one of the great loves of my life, The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. Bachelor in Paradise. I'm all in for The Bachelor. My wife and I spent pandemic. We couldn't watch any of the shows that we were used to, and so we said, okay, what can we handle during their lockdown? We can handle people in bathing suits making terrible relationship choices. So we watched all 7 seasons of Love Island and Are You the One and Too Hot to Handle and Love is Blind. We were like, yes, please, just that. So that's what my Twitter is primarily used for. So I'm findable. I'm around, and my website is nathan-scoggins.com, where you can see other things of other projects of mine that I've worked on and stuff like that.
Awesome. Well, I will put links to all that stuff down in the show notes down below. Nate, it has been a joy having you on the show today.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Ricky. I really appreciate it.
It was great connecting with Nate and talking about Christian filmmaking. Don't forget to check out the links in the show notes below and look for his film, What Remains, on video on demand services. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, click all those links down below. That way you can stay up with us and you'll be notified anytime we put out new content. And you can find all of our social links and links to our YouTube channel and to our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. If you enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. We've changed all of our Patreon levels, and every level has great benefits and makes a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers who are serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or to partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click on the support menu. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from 1 Thessalonians 5. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey.